Hey there, my name is James. Welcome to Game Stories, where we write games that tell stories. And in this episode, we are taking a look back at some of the previous videos, the last three. And we are asking ourselves, what are these small role-playing games? And how do I make my own? We've been looking at here, let me just bring this up. We've been looking at a bunch of different small role-playing games from the syllabus here. And playing them. And sort of, on the videos at least, I'm encouraging people to try to hack them, meaning take this set of rules, strip the theme out, put in a new theme, and then make whatever mechanical changes you need to make to feel like the system is now telling the story you want it to tell. That's a legitimate way to hack these things and to produce new games. But if you're the assignment here that we're working on is Rules Light Role-Playing Game, write your own. Write your own Rules Light role-playing game in 1 to 5 pages. And even if you've already played through all of these and read them in detail, you may still feel like you're not quite sure what to do to produce your own system. Now, I should be clear, you don't have to produce an entirely novel system. You're welcome to produce a hack of any of these, or to take mechanics from any one of them and push them together and create something new. Or if you do have a unique idea for a novel resolution mechanism or a different way to distribute narrative agency or something, go for it. But you don't have to be entirely original here. And I think if you've played through these, you'll see that there's a lot of overlap. The purpose of this video is to sort of take a look at all of these and think about what core elements do they have in common. What is a role-playing game? We'll address this question again. But from the perspective of what are the elements that have to be there in order for it to be considered a role-playing game, and if you're in my class, what elements have to be there in order for you to get credit for the assignment, right? So let's go back for a second to what is a role-playing game, Ebediah Ravachol. And this time we'll look at sort of the theoretical side of things. We've talked through his game, and hopefully you've played it, maybe even thought about how you would redesign it to tell a different kind of story. And in fact, well, we'll get that in a minute. This time we're going to look at his theory, right? We're going to look at the stuff in italics. So what he says about what a role-playing game is, first, it's a game that you play with friends in a social setting. You don't play role-playing games alone, although that's debatable now too, right? All these points are debatable, but his thesis is you don't play them alone, you play them with friends. It's a social thing. And it is an exploration of intriguing or fanciful scenarios, meaning with your friends, what are you doing? You're telling a story together. And not just any story, but a story that begins with a scenario that's intriguing or fanciful. And I've heard him talk elsewhere about how, I think a number of people said this, but I've heard him say this on a podcast somewhere, that good scenarios are ones that can't stay the same for very long. They have all this sort of narrative potential, right? They feel like they're pushing you to engage and to do something and to change the fictional world in some way right away. And of course, like being astronaut bank robbers immediately has a lot of push to it, right? Go rob the bank, go get on the space shuttle, see what happens. He says it's a chance to be someone you're not, meaning this is the role play part of role-playing games. I'm going to pretend to be a character, or at least be responsible for saying what a character does. In the role-playing game. He says it's a celebration of sticky situations, which means that between the scenario and the characters, the game rules should be setting me up to push me into complex situations where I have to make hard decisions, right? He says it's collaborative daydreaming, which means we're all going to work together to tell the story. He says it's an exercise for your personal sense of drama, which means one of the rules should support me pushing the story to dramatic moments of crisis, moments that need some kind of resolution mechanism to resolve them. He says it's a way to trick ourselves into creating interesting things, meaning the rule set should be one that as we're telling the story together, it sort of pushes sort of small creative prompts at me, like the security guard's trying to shoot you, what do you do? Or the lizard men on planet NQ9 are creeping up behind you as you do the tricorder scan. What do you do? Right? It prompts you to be inventive from the perspective of your character. And finally, he says it's something you've been doing all along, which I think just means, I think what he means by this is that if you've been following the rules so far, then you're already role-playing. This is what it is, right? This game is what it is. But if we pick, so that doesn't quite tell us though what we need to do to make a role-playing game. What elements do we need in order to make sure that it comes out of a, if we're going to make a cake, we need to know all the pieces of the recipe. Otherwise, we're going to get something else, right? So what are the pieces of the recipe here that if we use them, it'll be something like a role-playing game? He doesn't name them specifically, but it should be rules for telling a story together, right? That's sort of the intent of these games, is that they structure a conversation among people that is a storytelling conversation. They have some kind of character creation system so that people who are playing the game have a sense of who they are going to be in the scenario. They have some kind of a theme, right? They have or a way of, they either have a theme that they're giving you, or they have a rules for establishing a theme for the play. If you remember The Pool by James West, that one didn't have a specific theme, but one of the first things that it says is that sit around and talk about what kind of story you're going to tell together. So it wasn't themed already, it was a themeless RPG, but it had rules in place of that, right, to get us to tell a story. Lasers and feelings is a theme right up front, right? Character creation, theme, character creation, rules for telling a story, sticky situations. This is, some kind of a theme or how to get the game going, right? What is the first thing that players do in order to start this? Okay. You also need rules for, where does it say it in here? Here. Right here, right? This one. Yeah, rules for dividing the narrative responsibilities. Is there going to be a game master that's in charge of the world, and then the players are each responsible for one character, which is sort of classic and traditional? Or is it going to be something like this, where players can kind of take turns being in the spotlight, and the rest of the players will kind of facilitate the world for that person in the spotlight, and then they'll shift? Certainly a big part of the thesis here from Mr. Ravachol is that you don't need a game master. You don't need a game master, you don't need dice, but you do need a way to divide the narrative responsibility, who's in charge of talking about what in the story. And you do need some kind of resolution mechanism, which, there's 2 rules here devoted to how that works. Calling people out when they do something hard or harmful, and then how to resolve that, right? Also, some rules for how to progress the conversation and for how the game ends, right? In this case, it has rules for how the game finishes. I think you'll see that in Lasers in Feelings, for example, all that stuff is there too. You have a theme, you have a character creation system, also have a ship creation system. You have means for creating a scenario. It doesn't hand you a scenario, but it basically hands you a scenario generator. It divides narrative responsibility between players and game master. And it has a resolution mechanism for deciding what happens when things go wrong. And it also has some advice about how to structure the conversation and the flow of play. And it doesn't tell you when the game is over, right? In theory, you could keep playing Lasers and Feelings forever, I guess. But each of these scenarios has a kind of goal to it that structures a sense of what the narrative arc is going to be. What was our example before? Space pirates were stealing void crystals to reverse time, right? That has a certain sense of an arc to it that either that's going to happen, they're going to get the crystals in reverse time, or we're going to interrupt it. And if we interrupt it and save the day, then that feels like the story is complete, right? Okay, so what I've put in the assignment is that you should include a setting, roles and goals for players within that setting, a resolution mechanism like die rolling or voting, a role for the game master if one is needed, and maybe you don't, and a way of indicating whether the game story is complete. I might edit this actually because I think I've typed up somewhere else a slightly better one. Let's see, where is that? Do I have it open? Yes. Yeah. So your rules, your rule set, when you write your own role-playing game, should have at least this stuff, unless you have a good reason not to. Let's say that. It should be a rule set that's all about telling us how to tell a story together. That should be the intent and purpose, and it should be explicit about that. It needs to have some kind of theme or setting to let us know what kind of story to tell. Or alternately, it could have a random generator, or it could have a rule set that says, here's how to come up with your own theme, right? If you want to do it that way. It needs to have some kind of character creation system so that we know we're going to figure out how to be people inside of the story that we're going to tell. It needs to shape rules for how to get started, meaning it needs to say, when you first begin, the first part of the story is going to be this, right? Here's how to frame that first scene. Oh, you know what I didn't put here? Let's add this. Rules to structure flow of play. In other words, we need some kind of sense of how this conversation is going to take place. Is there, concrete turns where it's your turn to be the focus? Now it's your turn to say something. Now it's your turn to say something. Is there just kind of a sense that the game master will say a thing and then ask for a response from players and then narrate a result and then ask for another response? Is there sort of that kind of conversation? Is it more collaborative where we're kind of coming up together with the things that characters might do? Is it like Baron von Munchausen or Everyone is John, where there's some kind of bidding mechanism where we get to divide up narrative responsibility that way, right? The flow of play is sometimes about who can gain control by spending currency or bidding currency. So how does the conversation kind of flow back and forth? How do we divide the narrative responsibility? That's related, right? Is there a game master and players, or is it rotating, or is it something else? Is there a deck of cards that's telling us things to respond to? What's the resolution mechanism? In other words, when I do something that might hurt somebody or is questionable, is difficult, how do we decide what happens? Do we just let another player tell us? Do we bid to see whose resolution is the one that will win? Do we roll some dice? If so, what are the results? What are the odds? How do you want to structure the odds on the dice? And it should have, here I say it's a scenario with a clear goal or endpoint, meaning it should, whatever your scenario or your scenario creation method, it should end up with players having a sense of what they're trying to do, and when they accomplish that, it will feel like the story is somehow resolved, or that part of the story at least is resolved. It may be open to ongoing play, or it may be like what is an RPG where you'll die, go to jail, or go to space, and that's it. So you can structure endings that we're all shooting towards, or you can just give a sense of a clear goal, right? I think I will edit the assignment so that it's got these bullet points in it, because it's a pretty comprehensive set. Now, you can disagree with this set. The assignment is, and I would give this to everybody, if you're out there on the internet watching this and not in my class, I would suggest that you give this a try. Come up with sort of a small rule set that does all these things in as brief language as possible, and see if you can structure players telling the kind of stories you want them to tell. On a theoretical level, if you feel like, that's not what a role-playing game is, it doesn't need to have all those things, or hey, you forgot something, a role-playing game should also have this other thing, feel free to revise this set of rules, even if you're in my class. If you think like, I'm going to cut out these things, I think it'll still be a role-playing game. Or I want to do some really different creative take, and here's what it is, it'll still be a role-playing game, pitch it to me, right? If you're in my class, pitch it to me. If you're out there in the wild, do what you please. And this is kind of building on, where'd he go? Ravichal's point down here. Because his game is a game and it's an argument too, right? His game is like, here's what a role-playing game is. It's all these things. Here's the rules that make it work. This game is a role-playing game. If you're doing it, then right? And it doesn't use dice, and it doesn't use a game master, and it's not trying to model the probabilities of what it would be like to try to hit a dragon with a short sword and how much damage you might do. It doesn't have any kind of math in it. It's just people telling a story. You might disagree with that, and he knows that. He says, if you disagree with me about any of my answers to the question posed in the title, what is a role-playing game? Or if you have any sort of quibble with the game design itself, you must express this by making non-superficial changes to the game and text until it satisfies your concern and then distribute that new game under your name. All other forms of criticism will at best be ignored. In other words, hack away, take these rule set and change it any way you want. And especially if you think that I've answered the question wrongly. If you think that this is not a role-playing game, or that a role-playing game also needs something else, or that, you know what, a role-playing game doesn't even need this much structure. Maybe it can be less. He says, rewrite this game and then post it. And that'll be the only rebuttal he's willing to consider, right? It's sort of a design challenge that he's issuing here. Make the smallest, tightest role-playing game you can that in your mind is what a role-playing game should be. Okay, and that's just a great place to start, I think, which is why I'm assigning it. So I would issue the same kind of point here. Where'd it go? Which is that if these elements, which I'm kind of drawing these out of the examples I've given you, if you feel like these elements aren't comprehensive enough, you want to add more, go for it. If you feel like there's too many and some of these are not necessary, go for it. I'd be really curious to see what you come up with. So have fun designing, whether you're in my class or not. And that's it for this episode. So we'll see you next time. Thanks.